Okay, so let's get started. First of all, thank you for coming. I know it's been a long day, especially folks who've flown from far away, and I appreciate you all being here. I'm Erin Lentz. I'm a professor of public affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. And my colleague Siddha Narayanan, who's here from the Indira Gandhi Institute for Development Research in Mumbai, she and I, along with two co-PIs, Marzia Fontana and Bharati Kulkarni, who's from the National Institute of Nutrition. You may have seen her wandering the halls. We are round one IMANA grantees. And so what that means is we've been funded by IMANA to develop an index called the Women's Empowerment and Nutrition Index. And the way we did this was we first started to collect qualitative open-ended interviews from almost 400 women and some handful of men in Bihar, Odisha, and northwestern Bangladesh. We then used that information, as well as theory and our understanding of nutrition, to try to sift out what we thought were some of the main drivers of nutritional empowerment. So without further ado, we're gonna ask you guys. When we talk about empowerment for nutrition, what do you all think of? And this is totally open-ended. Yeah, Simone. Oh, I'm going to give you a microphone. Sorry. Can I have a microphone? Sorry, guys. This is being recorded. I forgot.
Control over resources to and decision-making power to purchase and decide what to provide for your household and buy for your household.
Cool. All right. So control over resources. All right. Oh, and can you also, I'm sorry, this is Simone. Can you say your name as well?
Simone Pastorelli from Harvard University.
Hi, Gianna Moniz Profumo from Charles Darwin University. I'd say autonomy in making the health-related decisions.
Great, okay. So decision-making capacity. All right.
Hi, I'm Priyanka Shah from Maharaja Sayajirao University. Intra-household food distribution.
Lovely. Okay, so what do you mean by that in the South Asian context? Can you talk a little more?
Having meals together and not feeding meals.
Right. So are women eating with the family? Are they eating last?
Yeah.
Yeah. So these kind of norms around food resources. Yeah. Other contributions? We've got an awesome table right here.
Okay. Yes, my name is Daniel Sapon of the University of Ghana. What comes to mind is the ability or the affordability of that person being able to buy a nutritious food.
Lovely. Yeah. So the capacity, then having enough resources to buy food. Yeah. Other things that drive nutrition? Oh, we've got a table back there. Lovely.
Access to the information. Sorry, I'm Kate Schneider from Tufts University, and I was thinking about access to information about what healthy choices are if someone wants to make them.
So having knowledge around what healthy food might be, or yeah, great. Same thing. Okay. So I think we have one here. Yeah.
Good knowledge, practice, and enabling environment for better nutrition.
Nutrition, okay.
Time availability of women for care.
Great. Okay, so care especially for women, for children especially, but also for themselves. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Hi, this is Tulika, ag economist with Apt Associates. So the point that I will make is probably applicable to everybody, including developed economies, which is the ability to actually make healthy choices. So you have the resources, you have the knowledge, but fried potatoes are simply yummy.
Yeah.
And they're yummy to everybody in this world, and so is sugar and cake. So that aspect of nutrition is pretty unique. It's in the sense of people making the right choices. So.
Okay, so making healthy choices. Yeah.
This is Rohini from Nandi Foundation. Knowing when something is going wrong. So we've done a nutrition kind of surveillance thing, and often parents don't even know that the child is not okay.
Okay.
Hi everyone, Ritesh here from Digital Green. For me, empowerment for nutrition for in context of women means she is getting minimum dietary diversity that is required for her.
So she's able to achieve adequate dietary diversity. Yeah. Yes. Great. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. This is Alessandra Gallier from ILRI. I think it also, for me, it has to do as well with ability to get the support of others to, put in practice a good nutrition practices.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a good one. Any other thoughts, comments? Let's see. I think so. This is great, and we will reveal this in sort of, oh, there you go, Sidha did it, fancy. So what we want to do today is to talk to you about how we have conceptualized women's empowerment in nutrition, and we'll give you our conceptual definition. We also want to talk to you about different themes that we used to construct our Women's Empowerment in Nutrition Index, and these themes map into exactly what you all have spoken of. Issues of knowledge, resources, agency, as well as achievements. Those are our final outcomes we're interested in. Questions around food, health, fertility for some folks, and institutions. And so, oh, thank you. Oh, thank you. Okay. So our goals today is to introduce the idea of nutritional empowerment, to show you the different dimensions and domains, which we're calling, these are the themes of nutritional empowerment. And then we'll use that information to construct an index all together. And then what we hope to do at the very end is to show you some findings that validate our work from South Asia, that suggest that we can in fact predict anemia and BMI effectively with the Women's Empowerment and Nutrition Index. So that's where we're headed today. There'll be a little bit of PowerPointing because we can't avoid it in a 2-hour session, but we'll try to be pretty quick, and then we'll get down to looking at the indicators and talking about how to compute the index. Does that sound like a plan? Yeah? All right. Here we go. Cool. So what's our motivation? Well, our aim is to contribute to a shift in thinking about empowerment in the context of women's own nutrition. And so some of the things that came up in the last slide were about children's nutrition. And today we're only going to be talking about what are the factors that matter for women's own nutrition. And the reason why is because oftentimes there's a focus on either children or maternal and child health. And we're trying to make this statement, the claim that everyone has a right to adequate nutrition, adults included who maybe don't have children. Empowerment is oftentimes heavily used. I think every presentation I've been to at the Learning Lab so far has argued the importance of empowerment for nutritional outcomes, and we agree with that. But I think what we're trying to say is that there isn't a measure that looks at empowerment specific to the domain of nutrition. And so why might this matter? Well, it turns out there might be trade-offs. Right? And so some of our research has shown that women's empowerment in some spheres might not translate into women's empowerment in other spheres. So we heard over and over again about women who were engaging in paid work, women who are making decisions around agriculture, but we're still eating last and least, and we're still undernourished. Right? And so it's not the case necessarily that having access or having the ability to achieve empowerment in one domain will necessarily translate elsewhere, right? And so there's variations in the spheres in which people are empowered. There's also, empowerment is a process. It might not leak over instantaneously if one becomes empowered in one person's aspect of their lives. It might not necessarily follow that they will immediately be empowered elsewhere. Secondly, another motivation is that some existing empowerment measures don't always correlate with women's own nutrition. And so there's this great review study by Prattley et al. That shows there's lots of different ways of measuring empowerment, but sometimes those empowerment measures are generally pretty strongly associated with children's outcomes, but for women's outcomes themselves, it's a little bit more mixed. And so we're arguing, well, maybe part of the reason why is because women often, so they tell us, are prioritizing their children's nutritional status ahead of themselves. Totally normal. I have a child. I would do the same thing. But what that means is that there's a potential gap between what we're observing for children and what we're observing for moms, or what we're observing for children and we're observing for women who don't have children. And we don't want to presume that children's nutritional outcomes are going to be the adequate marker for nutritional status of everyone else in the household. It might very well be the case, but we don't know, right? And the reason why we don't know is because it's so rare to collect adult nutritional information. And so this is where we're coming from, and this is what our qualitative data told us again and again, was women prioritizing getting their kids fed, their kids to school, and only then are they going to be spending money to make sure they have enough for an adequately nutritious diet for themselves, right? So food is often, or health and food are often second, third, fourth priorities for some of the women in our sample. So that's why we're thinking about nutritional empowerment. So what is nutritional empowerment? Well, this is the definition that we have come up with. It's the process by which individuals acquire the capacity to be well-fed and healthy. We think this has three components. The first is gaining access to and control over intakes of food which is adequate and nutritious. The second is having knowledge about and say over health and nutritional practices. And the third is being able to draw support from both family and other institutions in securing and maintaining an adequate diet and good health. These kind of roughly break down. Let's see if I can use my pointer. No pointer. Okay, the first. This first one is sort of suggestive of agency, right? Like, are women able to have adequate say, control over the decisions around food choices, around health choices? The second is having adequate information, right? So having knowledge. And then this third is resources. So someone in the back suggested support of others, including their own family members, but also potentially including government, social protection programs, et cetera. And what we're interested in is not just that women might be well-fed and healthy, but whether or not women have a meaningful choice in achieving that. So how did we come up with this definition? Well, it was a lot of work, but what we ended up doing was drawing from two main streams of literature. The first is the UNICEF 1990 framework, which argues that some of the main drivers for child nutrition and maternal nutrition are access to food, like food choices, health, and then sort of this underlying kind of environmental factors, which we're referring to as institutions. For adults, for women, we also include fertility where relevant, right? The ability to control one's reproductive health can impact women's nutritional status. So the UNICEF framework gives us what we refer to as the domains of nutrition. Naila Kabir's work, she developed a way of thinking about and conceptualizing empowerment. She argues that resources, agency, and achievements are constituent components of empowerment. Empowerment is not just about making decisions. It's about having the resources to draw from in order for you to make those decisions and for you to ultimately actually be able to achieve those decisions. What's different about our definition is that we separate knowledge from resources. So Naila Kabir considers knowledge one component of resources. Because knowledge is so important for nutrition, we sort of isolate that because there's so many different behavior change and communication interventions. We wanted to be able to track that. Achievements refer to both intermediate and final achievements. So the final achievements for us, we're looking at anthropometric outcomes, BMI, anemia. Intermediate achievements might be things like dietary diversity. So we use these two ideas, these dimensions of empowerment, these domains of nutrition, and we come up with our little grid. And so our grid is the Women's Empowerment in Nutrition grid. And as you can see, the dimensions run across our columns and the domains run across the sides. And it's a little bit difficult to see in this particular slide, but each of these boxes then becomes a source for us of something we're trying to measure. So we're trying to get a sense of what is food knowledge? Do women have food knowledge? Do women have health resources? Do women have adequate fertility agency, control over their own reproductive health? We think institutions cut across all of those things, all of those different domains of empowerment, dimensions of empowerment. And what we then do is we take this kind of framework and we try to identify indicators that help us measure each of these different components. So in sum, there's 10 that we're looking to measure. 3 related to food, 3 related to health, 3 related to fertility. Institutions would be 10. And then we're measuring our final achievements of BMI and anemia to understand whether or not we're doing a good job with the index. One thing that we're not going to talk about fertility today because it is interesting but relevant for a smaller subsample of our population. We also consider work as a cross-cutting issue, and we'll talk more about that later. We'll show you guys a short little video, because work can be both helpful, having access to paid employment, which can expand your food choices, but if you're doing onerous work, that can actually be can be a caloric deficit. And so that can actually undermine one's health if you're out breaking rocks, for example. And so work cuts both ways. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Siddha.
Thank you. So I think one, let me just get this. Yeah, so as Erin pointed out, we are going to be looking, we call each of these domain dimensions because they are combinations of domain and dimensions. So we are going to be working with 7: Food Knowledge Resource Agency, Health Knowledge Resource Agency, and institutions. And we've tried to keep it simple without being too simplistic. So you're going to see and we're going to share with you some of the challenges we faced in implementing this. So the way we went about it is we did a lot of research on existing surveys, literature, to identify potential indicators that would represent each of these domain dimensions well. So we started with a large number of indicators, about 165 or so, and we implemented a very detailed survey. And then our goal was to then pare it down using different techniques, which we won't go into, to identify what is that minimal set of indicators that we are comfortable with that also predicts BMI and anemia well. So you have a handout already that lists the themes that fall under. So you have both this picture and a longer list of indicators. So I would say that we are not going to look at it during this learning lab, but it's something you can take back with you. So if you want to implement it in your field site, this is a good indicator of the themes that you might want to cover. There could be more, you might want to drop some, but that's left to you. But this sort of represents the themes that we wanted to cover. And this is the list of indicators we used. It's a 40 indicator WANI, which 40 is quite a lot, but given that we started with 165, we were relieved that it ended at 40. We are not going to use this list. That's for you to take home. We are going to do a much more abridged version just to get a flavor of how it works. So the question is, there are many people who dislike indices because, as we know, empowerment is a process, it's dynamic, it's complicated, it's multidimensional, and what do we gain by reducing it into a simple number? And the justification usually that's given, yes, an index involves a lot of loss of detail, but it's useful to track progress, to compare communities and social groups, because as we said, there are some who are systematically disadvantaged. And in fact, even though this learning lab is called Women's Empowerment and Nutrition Index, our index is devised so that we can measure one for any adult individual. So we then get an opportunity to compare male spouses and the women, also mothers-in-law and daughters-in-law, and we'll show you some results on that. So it does help you make comparative assessments of whether people are nutritionally empowered. And the Venn grid, as we've constructed, is actually a useful way to think about where the biggest weak links are in terms of policy efforts. So we think of the index as one part of a larger set of tools and heuristics that helps policymakers. With that, I'm going to just establish some rules. We didn't establish them, but anyone who wants to compute any index essentially has to work with a few limitations. What are they? If you want to compute an index for any individual, they should, for any indicator, they should have a response. If they say no response, not applicable, then you can't give them a value. So for every indicator, for every person, you need a 0 or 1, and that leads to a few problems, okay? And I'll start with the second problem. For example, in India, dietary restrictions is very important. Very often, the daughters-in-law fast, they don't have meat, but the mothers-in-law can, and we found instances which are quite unfortunate for the daughter-in-law, where the mother-in-law prayed that the daughter-in-law would abstain from meat. So the daughter-in-law didn't have any choice, and she inherited with her marriage the idea that she wouldn't eat meat. So when there are restrictions like this, you say that, do you have a dietary restriction? And they can say yes or no. But then the follow-up question is, can you stop, can you give up these restrictions at your own free will? And if you do have a restriction, you can say yes or no. But if you didn't have restrictions, you're going to say it's not applicable. I don't have a restriction. In these cases, there's going to be a not applicable for freedom to not have dietary restrictions, but you need to assign a code as to whether it's 0 or 1. And in our entire effort, we have said that if you don't have restrictions, and therefore you didn't answer the follow-up question, you're empowered and you're going to get a 1. And if you said you have restrictions and said you could give it up whenever you wanted to, then also you got 1, because you at least can opt out. But if you said you had restrictions and you had no choice, then you were disempowered. So there is this little bit of complexity that you will see, and we've given examples of those. The other issue that we need to tackle, again common to most indices, are that when you have continuous or ordinal scale variables, like how often does your family sit and eat together? It may be all the time, sometimes, occasionally, very rarely. And then you want to put them into 0, 1 categories. And that's again very subjective because it depends on the context. Yeah, so where you draw the line is entirely up to you. So in this examples that we do today, you're going to see a lot of instances where you're going to see this and say, but no, this doesn't make sense. I would do it differently. And please do it differently. I don't think there is anything in this that's hard and fast. You have to look at your context, see what's relevant, and see where the cutoffs are based on what you know about the context and what the literature perhaps says about the context. And for complex indicators, you might need to combine 2 or more questions. And the example on dietary restrictions, essentially, you can you can combine a question whether or not you have dietary restrictions, and the second question follow up on whether or not you can give it up into one indicator, and that indicator would be, do you have any dietary restrictions? Sorry, are you free from dietary restrictions? Or if you do, can you give it up on your own? And that becomes your indicator. So you can combine multiple questions into a single indicator. So invariably, the number of questions you ask in a survey will be way more than the number of indicators you capture. And you have to work with the best you can to reduce the survey burden. And there's no right way to capture a theme, and we can't overemphasize that. It depends on the context, and we experimented with several ways. And I have 2 examples of ways. So somebody here mentioned norms around eating. And there are so many ways in which you can ask this question, and we tried all of them at different points of time. So you say, how often do you eat last? Always, mostly, occasionally. You can also ask, how often does the entire family eat together? Now here is this is a tricky question, because you ask the men, they're going to say we eat together always. When you ask the women, they're going to say never. So then you have discordant responses, and you don't know which one was the right response. And there's a lot of literature on these kind of questions. So we try to select questions where we didn't run into those kind of problems with the data. So how often does the entire family eat together? Can you eat whenever you wish to? How often can you eat whenever you wish to? So these are all variants of the same question, and you need to choose what works for you. And the other issue that came was on time availability. And I think Erin emphasized that we introduce work. So most of the existing women's empowerment in agriculture index presumes that they work in agriculture. But very often, if you're working in the non-farm sector, the quality of employment may be really brutal and very poor and very hazardous and lowly paid. So we sort of said work is quite important. And many people use time use data to see if there is a time poverty element aspect to empowerment. And we decided that was a very intensive way and time consuming way. So we chose to ask a set of questions like, is there any day in the last week when you actually chose not to do any work at all out of your own free will? And then do you have any time to pursue any activity besides household or other work? And do you feel you get enough sleep or enough rest? And there are 2 things that we found very interesting in qualitative research. At any FGD, when you went and asked, who's the first in your house to wake up? And it would be all the younger women. And there were instances where the mothers-in-law and daughters-in-law both claimed they were the first to wake up. And then we had a little discussion, and they agreed that it was the daughter-in-law who woke up first. So even these actually we found were very informative. So even if you don't get actual time spent, we found that this was actually a very good proxy. But as you can see, the point here is there are multiple ways of asking it, and we have no sense ahead of time which one would be the best. So what we are going to, so this is sort of the background. And what we are going to do now is to move over to a few modules. And you all have handouts that actually have modules. You're going to see 7 distinct pages which have the domain dimension. And what we are going to do now is to do food resources and health resources first to illustrate some of the complexity in putting together an indicator. Okay, so the way we'll do it is I'll just go over each of these modules, and then each table can have a discussion. Maybe you can have, each person can ask someone to your left or to your right, so that you get some data that we can work with. Is that okay? Any questions at this stage?
So just to give you guys a little bit of context, what we're planning to do is we'll go over each of the 7 main dimensions. And so right now we're going to work on food resources together, and then we'll do health resources together, and then we'll break you all up into doing one more on your own, and then we'll kind of come back and report scores and then compute the actual index collectively. So that's where we're headed. So this will be showing you all how we have created the index. And I think just to emphasize Sudha's point, we think we've got the domain dimensions that matter, and our results tend to really strongly suggest that these are important things. And this is a useful way of bucketing some of these questions. But we're not necessarily wedded to the specific questions. Those questions might change in the context that you're in. So just to give you kind of a big picture of where things are headed.
Yeah, so what we'll start off doing is, if you can all turn to the food resources, which is page 2, you see a bunch of questions up to 3B, so it's just one page. And from this food resources, you see in parentheses that it says 7. And essentially, we are going to try and use these questions to build 7 distinct indicators. This is not what we did in our Veni paper, the original index, but this is just to illustrate. So we have 7 indicators to work with. So essentially, we are going to get 7 0, 1 variables, which we can total and give a score for that particular food resources. Yeah, so if you look at the first question, I'm just going to read out the question. There are a lot of definitional issues on what is work, what do you mean by this, what do you mean by that. But we leave that out from this. I think the focus here is on how do you get a score and how do you move on. So we leave the definitional issues and different nuances of how to ask the question for later or for outside the lab. So we are going to ask, which of the following activities have you participated in the past 1 year? And we're going to say, did you do paid work for wages? Did the woman have her own enterprise, which she managed and controlled? And was there a family enterprise that's non-agricultural? Whether she had a farm, which belongs to the household, and an own farm, which is basically livestock, aquaculture, poultry, and so these 5 questions. And each of these is an indicator. So you write 1 if they did have access to this, and 0 if they didn't. The idea being that a majority of the income, around 54% of India's per capita income, is spent on food. So if you have paid work, we have classified it mainly as a food resource. Of course, it's also used as a health resource, but we've classified it as a food resource because it really drives what you spend on food. And access to cultivation and animal husbandry essentially says that you have access to a more diverse diet because you're growing it, or you have access to animal source foods. So we won't go into further detail on the logic of why we included it, but so you have 5 indicators that are coming from here. And then we are going to ask, did you get any support? Okay, we have talked about different activities. We would like to understand what kind of aid or support or inputs have you benefited from? And this is not the household, it's directed to the individual you're asking. And if they've got any support, be it of credit, training, any support, it gets a 1. If there's no support, you get a 0. So here is again access to resource that helps them acquire food. And then we are going to, Okay, and then here is the dietary restriction that we've already talked a bit about. Do you have any dietary restrictions? And these restrictions should not be because you have a medical condition or because it's not available. It's a restriction that represents a norm. And if they say there are no restrictions, then you just don't go further. But if they do say they have restrictions, you ask, why do they do this? And this captures norm abidance. If it's out of your own free will, then you have agency. If it's not, then you're abiding to a norm, so which is a structural constraint on resources. Okay, so we ask, why do you do this? So this might as well, if they do it out of their own free will, you might want to consider it food agency. So, but I've just put it here just to alert you to the sequence of questions. And then if you wish to stop, so irrespective of whether it was your own free will or not, for starting, if you have any restrictions, if you wish to stop, would you be able to? And now we've marked in bold the things that represent empowerment. So if you have no restrictions, or if you have restrictions and you can stop, so it's just coming from 3 and 3B, then we are going to call you empowered. Okay, so now we have indicators that actually, I'm counting only, yes. So we have 7 indicators, 5 coming from the kind of work that they do, 1 coming from support for agriculture or any enterprise, and 3rd coming from dietary restrictions. So this is our food resources, yeah? So I'm now going to just go over the health resources. Oh, okay, yeah. Okay, so I believe that most of you have already discussed how to tackle these complex questions. So the first question is quite straightforward. You either did it or you did not. Although I know there are questions about what do you mean by own land, does it access, is it leased? We are not going into that in the learning lab. So you, whichever way you interpreted it, we'll go with that. But just to say that we were aware of these and our questionnaire has all of those details. The second is whether they got any support, and that would have also been okay. For the dietary restriction, basically there are 3 contexts in which we are going to call someone empowered. Okay, if for question 3, they opted for 5, that is no restrictions. If that's the case, they get a 1. If they have restrictions, and in 3A, they said they do it out of their own free will, we are not going to see that as a source of disempowerment, so they again get a 1. So if it's a combination of not 5 and 3 and 4 and 3A, they get a 1. And if there's a third context in which, again, they get a 1, which is if they don't have dietary, if they do have dietary restrictions, so question 3 is not 5. But 3B, they say they can leave whenever, they can give it up whenever they want. So the only person here who's disempowered, the ones who are going to get 0, are those who have dietary restrictions and cannot give it up on their own free will. So they are considered disempowered. Now this is a good illustration of where we chose to draw the line, but you might want to draw the line at differently. In fact, there are many contexts in which there may not be dietary restrictions at all, in which case this is not part of nutritional empowerment at all. In the Indian context, it was quite a valid concern. Yeah.
Yes, I have restrictions. And we can directly ask them now, if you wish to stop, would you be able to do, should we have this 3A necessary?
In fact, I think we included 3A so that you see the cluster of questions. And in fact, some would argue that 3A actually talks more about agency than resources. Because if I'm doing it out of my own volition, then I have a choice on whether or not I have dietary restrictions. So you could choose to say that in the context I'm looking at, it's actually agency. In our context, actually very few people did it anything out of their own free will. So we sort of, for us, it just became 3 and 3B became the relevant. So this is a good illustration of the subjectivity and how you might want to work with it. So now we gave a space for computing the binary indicator in case you needed it, but now you now have 7 indicators with 0 ones. Okay, so.
Or just a comment on the dietary restrictions. Do you account if if it's a woman, is pregnant or not? Because there may be restrictions that only apply during that period.
Yeah, so for most of the indices, we treat pregnant women very differently. Indeed, even women of reproductive age, because the dynamics and sources of disempowerment are very different. And in fact, in the Indian context, when you're married, you have a set of restrictions, and as you become older and you become the mother-in-law, your status in the household changes. So a lot of these restrictions are very fluid. And we do treat, we've excluded pregnant women. We included many of them in our survey, but for the computation of weaning, we deal with their restrictions very differently. In fact, the fertility module that we won't go into asks about specific dietary restrictions during pregnancy and after childbirth.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so if we are all okay with this, we could.
Sure. Yes. So your number, what should your number range between? If we have 7 indicators and each one will be between 0 and 1, you should have ended up with a score that's somewhere between 0 and 7. Did anyone not get a number between 0 and 7? Okay. We're going to come visit you. So the idea is questions 1A through 1E could be, each one of those would be 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0. And then you're going to have this question here that's going to be 1 or 0. So those first 6 will be 1, 0, up to 6. And then we're combining these 2 questions here. And so this is part of the challenge, is when you're asking a survey, you don't want to have this really complicated question. You often have a multi-part survey, and then you have to go back and combine them all. And so that's what we're showing you here, is there's this subjective component of how you combine these pieces to get that 0, 1 ultimately. Okay, so I'm going to visit the folks who, okay, so some folks haven't gotten 0 to 7 at that table. I'm going to visit you guys. And then Tulika, did you have a question? The mic keeps disappearing.
I was just wondering what's a blockbuster score on this, because we got 2 and we were just discussing that we might be pretty empowered, and so because 1 was because 1 is just simply, we're all doing paid work and we don't have a farm and blah blah blah. But 1 could be very low. I might have paid work, but I just don't have enough to buy. So it doesn't account for the ranges of income that people may have. Like a landless laborer, paid work, gets a daily wage, is just not adequate. So what is the ideal score, and how do you actually evaluate the index?
So I think it's harder to talk about the ideal score, but it's easier for us to address the income issue, because one of our indicators is, for the paid work that you do you get at least minimum wage? And how many different distinct types of work do you do? Because many people may get low wages per task, but they do plural activities so that they get income. But at the same time, there's a trade-off, because the more you're working, the less leisure you have. So what is picked up as a positive food resource in terms of income and access to employment is taken away as a negative health resource based on occupation and hazards and all of that. So in terms of the ideal indicators, we've done Bihar and Orissa. We'll show you some of the results. We find that 0.5 scores overall on the nutritional empowerment is what we used as a cutoff, but most women are significantly lower than that. But we also went to Tamil Nadu and Kerala and did the same thing. And they've basically, it's difficult to compete with the Tamil Nadu women. They have scores of 0.9 and 0.8 overall. But we'll come back to that. Yeah. So, okay, the problem, that's a learning lab constraint. We have not showed you all the indicators. We hope in our full paper, you're convinced that we have captured it such that the 2 would actually come up as empowered if they were doing salaried work, sedentary work, all of that. Yeah,
absolutely. This is, I think, please do not take this home with you and use it as a survey module. It is not complete. But point well taken, yeah. Okay, so any other questions before we move on to health resources? We'll give this another group shot and then we'll split you all into different tables, into different domain dimensions and compute the index together after.
Health resources. Okay, so we'll move on to health resources, and we have 3 indicators for health resources. And this illustrates another kind of combination question. So we have picked, the first question says, in general, for the different kinds of work that you do, how intense is the majority of the work that you do? Okay, this is like a really vaguely worded question, because what is majority, what is not? But this is just for the learning lab. In our survey, actually, this is actually coming from a sequence of 4 or 5 different questions. It asks, what tasks are you involved in? Is it laborious or backbreaking? Or so just take this at face value for now. And we ask whether for the majority of the work that you do, would you classify it as backbreaking, heavy, moderate, light, or sedentary? So if it's backbreaking, we treat them as disempowered. If it's heavy, moderate, or light, we just call it, we assign 1. Okay, so that's your first indicator. And then we ask, in any work that you do, which includes all kinds of work, including care work, domestic, household enterprise, all of anything that you do, would you say there's a moderate to high risk of injury, death, health problems, and harassment? This again in our survey comes up as separate indicators, but for now we've just pulled it together to get a very general indicator. And so if they say no, or they say yes, but one of the problems exist in some of the tasks, then we still sort of say we'll give them 1 and treat them as empowered. But if they say there's one or the other problems that exist in most of the tasks I do, then you treat them as disempowered. So here we had a printing error, so we fixed it by hand. So the 0 and 1, I hope it's clear to you. What does this do? Going back to the question that Tulika raised, you may be a salaried employer and you may get very low scores there, but you're going to then score very high, because if you have sedentary salaried work, you don't have a negative health resource. Whereas if you do lots of paid work, you have your own farm, but they're all hazardous, backbreaking, then you're going to score very low on the health resource dimension. So to some extent, there is a trade-off. Then the third question, we have a very simple indicator that says that if you have improved toilets, improved water, drinking water sources, both based on the WHO classification, and if you have a well-ventilated kitchen, then we are going to say you're empowered. So you need all these 3 to be counted as empowered. So you have, so whatever is bold is the improved version. And we've put what fuel does your household usually use for cooking. Now, you might not want to ask for well-ventilated kitchens. You might want to ask for source of fuel. So we've put it there. We are not going to include it. We are just going to use 3B and 3C. So if all of they are empowered on each of them, then they get a score of 1. So if you could work on the health resources, we'd be done.
So your scores should be between 0 and 3.
Okay, so let's get together on the health resources. So we've designated 3 indicators for this. There were some questions on why only 3 and why a strict condition on ventilated, improved, and okay. So let's just revisit it. I think the first and the second are fairly straightforward. The third one, so we want every individual to have access to clean water, to toilet facilities, as well as improved toilet facilities, as well as being free from indoor air pollution. This is particularly relevant for women who tend to cook in these spaces. So we said we're going to impose the strict condition on this, and only if they have each of these will they be scored as empowered. If even one of them doesn't work for them, they are going to be classified as disempowered. You could have a different perspective and say, even if they have only one of these working, they're better off, and I'm going to classify them as empowered. Again, it's context dependent and researcher dependent. So, and we need to look at the sensitivity of the index to these things, but we've taken a strict condition because wash and indoor air pollution are actually important policy interventions. If you don't have it, we want to make sure that it comes up as not having it. Okay. With that, we'll stop with the health resources and food resources. Now, what we're going to do is to assign one domain dimension for each table. And we have fewer topics than there are tables. But if you could take a few minutes to actually work through those modules, so you're all not going to be working on the same modules, then collectively we would have covered this entire domain dimension. Then we'll come back again and share our scores. So, and then we can watch the film on work.
Okay, so while you're getting things assigned, did anyone get a score that's more than between 0 and 3? Okay, awesome. To help you guys see the process is that what we have here is this is the survey, and we're taking survey responses and trying to code them into 0-1 indicators that we then use for the index. And so we're starting with kind of the raw data, and so that's why it's tricky, but that's why we wanted to show it to you all, because it is a subjective process and it's complicated, as you guys are getting to see. You all are welcome to interview as many of each other as you'd like, but we're going to ask the table for just
to the way the questions were worded or what we were asking. Please bear in mind, especially those working on institutions, this was Bihar and Orissa, where many people are not allowed to travel to visit their family. The family cannot visit them. This is the parental family. So in the marital home, the girl's parents cannot come and visit them. Many people have never traveled outside the village after their marriage. So, and many people use the veil, which is also very context specific. So a lot of the institutional questions in particular are very context specific, and ours was for the specific context of Bihar and Orissa. We'll tell you more about the findings soon. And I think there are not many other, even for the health knowledge question, for example, where malaria is endemic, we put in the malaria questions, but something else may be important in another context. And of course, the way we worded the question sounds like we want people to get malaria, because it says, how can you get malaria? That's just a translation from Hindi. So yeah, so this tests awareness of ORS, malaria, and whatever other endemic diseases that are actually relevant for nutrition. Yeah. Okay, now what we are going to do is we are going to get a score for each of these domain dimensions. While Shri is going to compute the scores so that we can come back and take a look at how it's done, we'll move on to a film. So right now, let's start with health resource. Okay, so Shri has now collected scores so that we can illustrate how there are 7 domain dimensions, how it's scored, and how you then convert it and aggregate it into an index. In the meantime, we wanted to share with you this film. Actually, when we started our work, we did extensive qualitative field work in Orissa and Bihar. And one of our collaborators there, Sabarmati, works a lot on women's work in agriculture and health-related issues. And it's this is a film based on her work. And I think in terms of context, there are many countries in the world you could actually relate this to. So we'd just like you to watch the film that makes the connection between work and nutrition.
यार 50 मन करक शुरू करला इस रूपा
अब छोट बेटा के काय याद रही बाबू
जति बेटा वही के का कौन करता
सिखाने अब इतना बढ़ा लिखने रूपा रपुली
तो कते बेरा घुरत रहा
उतरा में जात रही
कते बेरा घुरत रहा रूपा पे जाय काले घर घुरत रही कते
हम 4 बजे
4 बजे हनु खा डाणा मन बात करे कि नहीं डाणा मन
छुआ बेरा कहीं बैठ रहे ले पाछे पाछे बात लाख वो है डांडा बाथा में तो रोपा आई जले बात है.
For her whole working life, Philini grew rice. Now, at the age of 78, her body is crippled, bent double, so she's now the same height she was when she started working in the fields. It's estimated that there are around 1 billion rice growers across the world, and more than half of them are women. Typically, a woman's role is to uproot seedlings, transport them to the paddy fields, transplant them, weed the field, and, with their menfolk, harvest the crop. Sabarmati is an Indian researcher looking into the impacts of this work on women's bodies and on the general well-being.
A woman, on average, spends around 150 hours for transplantation, for another 150 hours for weeding, another 150 hours for removal of seedlings and transporting to the main field. So altogether comes around 450 to 500 hours per 1 acre. So 1000 to 1500 hours per 1 hectare. So it's a huge time.
Typically, rice is transplanted when seedlings are 30 to 45 days old. Sabarmati has calculated that each bundle transported weighs an average of 1.5 kilograms. The seedlings are transplanted in tight clumps. This work is done, bent over, in flooded fields and under monsoon rains. This leads to a large number of physical problems, from disease to malnourishment and undernourishment to, eventually, musculoskeletal disorders.
I found that it's a time when most people are diseased, like malaria, typhoid, all sorts of vector-borne diseases are there at that time, and because of the wet environment they get severe infections like candidiasis, tinea. So they're diseased, cold, fever, coughing, those kind of, but they continue to work. And at that time of the year, like the beginning of the monsoon, the vegetable rate is very high in the market. They can't afford to buy vegetables. And whatever little they buy from the market, it's a social system. They give the majority of that to the men folks, to the children, and whatever is left out or not, they eat that.
During the rice growing season across South and Southeast Asia, women can be seen working vast swathes of land. Dokeo Simon Kun lives in Khamwan province, Laos, and reports the same kind of problems.
เพราะว่าต้องก้มมันลกก้านะอันจิบเอวเนาะส่วนหลายนะแล้วกล่าวว่าขออนุญาตนำเด้ออันนี้นะอันตีนที่ว่าถือน้ำกัดหลายเนาะคือตีนในอย่างเกาะหัวเล็บมันเสียนะตัวนั้นเนาะจะถือว่าเพราะว่าเฮาก็ยาวนานกับอันการที่ว่าเฮาเฮ็ดหนึ่งมาต้องไปเสียเวลาอยู่บนก้าหันแล้วก็ดำตัวนั้นเนาะเจ็บเอวสลายเจ็บหลังเจ็บเอวเลย
Dokeo discusses the subject with fellow rice growers who also speak of severe physical problems. When she asks her fellow farmers to illustrate the places where they feel most pain, there's a consensus of opinion. And what is true in Laos is also true in India.
ଆମେ ରୋଇସୁଁ ଫଲା ରୋଇବାରେ ଟିକେ କଷ୍ଟ ହେସି ସେଟା ଟିକେ ପାଖେ ଜଗା ହେସି
Sabarmati developed this visual way of communicating with farmers about their experience of physical pain brought about by their work. When carrying out her research, Sabarmati was struck by the fact that although these occupational health problems are common, the women rice farmers she spoke with had never discussed them with researchers before.
So they were quite excited about it, and it was strange. They said, no one ever asked us about these questions.
Sabarmati's work involves comparing the impacts of traditional rice growing against the impacts of rice produced under the system of rice intensification, or SRI, an innovative, climate-smart method of rice growing in which the key input is knowledge and which can result in much lower costs and higher yields.
The women were very articulate about their experiences while they were explaining the impact of SRI. They were really not talking too much about yield and cost and those things.
Under SRI, young seedlings are planted in wide spaces. This means that women have to carry and plant up to 90% fewer seedlings. Furthermore, those seedlings are younger and so weigh less. This also means the women spend less time in the fields. Also, where possible, water is drained from the fields to aerate the plants, so water disease is reduced. The wide spacing allows for the use of a mechanical weeder. Felicita Topner is a rice farmer from Orissa, India.
अधिक जमीरे चाष करि पारुछु आ से हिसाब रे हमर अमलता भी बेसी आसुछि आ हमर मेहनतटा बहुत माने सहज उपाय रे आमे ठिया है कि आमे कन्योडर चलै कि आमे जेमति जमी के उर्वर करि किरि.
In Laos, on the day that women rice farmers first tried transplanting according to SRI, Dokhayo asked the group for their immediate thoughts.
ครบเบิดเลยมันบอกบัดนี้เวลาบัดนี้มื้อนี้เนาะหันเฮาเฮ็ดนาแบบนี้หันเฮาก็มันง่ายบ่หรือมันยากล่ะมันก็ง่ายแหละคือมันนี่สิง่ายแม่นบ่
SRI is a low-cost, high-yielding way of growing rice, but it is also a way to greatly reduce and even entirely eliminate the severe physical impact of rice growing on the people who practice it. People whose problems are generally invisible until it is too late, and like Femini, they've been bent back to the height of the small child that they once were when their lives as rice farmers began.
This film was made in the context of SRI, but we just wanted to highlight the links between women's health and work. In ways that indices can never capture. So we are acutely aware of all that we are missing out when you try to measure something as complicated as this relationship. So we'll leave it at that. And now this just gave Shri and Mohit to compute the index itself. So what we've done is collected a few responses and we'll just see how the index is constructed. So you have 7 domain dimensions and the board here is too small and I could just write it here. Okay. So now we just picked scores from different tables. So in food knowledge, you have, we picked 0 out of 4. That's 0 being disempowered. The higher the score, the more empowered. Food resource is 4 out of 7. Food agency is 3 out of 6. Health knowledge 2 out of 6. Health resource 1 out of 3. Health agency 5 out of 5. And institutions 2 out of 7. Now you immediately see that even before the aggregation step, you get a very good sense of the domain dimension wise deficits in empowerment. So if you think of empowerment as a process and there being obstacles that thwart the process of empowerment, you can actually decompose this and see which domain dimension are we scoring least. And that becomes a policy focus of, it doesn't indicate anything in terms of what policy should be, but it sort of raises the red flag saying there is potential for intervention here. And this is one of the attractive attributes of indices that are multidimensional in ways that I'll tell you. So there are two ways in which you can compute an index or aggregate it. I can just total the raw scores. So you get a total score and you have 38 indicators that we worked with today, and you can get an aggregate score. What is the problem with that? You don't want to do simple aggregation because I can get 0 in everything except 2 domain dimensions where I score full points. So you're going to have somebody, for example, who has 7 in food resource and institutions can have 7, 7, 14. And how do you compare them with somebody who is moderately empowered in each of the domain dimensions? So this leads to so a simple aggregation is one way of computing an index, but this doesn't do justice to the fact that it suggests that you can make up for deficits in some dimensions, but by empowering women or men in another dimension. And we didn't want that because for us, empowerment is an intrinsic value and we want everyone to be empowered in each of these domain dimensions. So Sabina Alkari and James Foster, in the context of poverty, they've developed a multidimensional poverty index, which has been very effectively used as the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index. So that where the process is slightly different. So what we do now is to compute domain dimension wise scores. So you just divide 0 over 4, 4 by 7, 3 over 6, and go on to get a domain dimension specific score. And now this will lie between 0 and 1 because you've adjusted for the number of questions. So it's possible to actually change your index and ask a lot of questions in where they're most empowered and change the index. In this, here the indicator is not that sensitive to the number of questions you ask in each domain dimension. But so leaving that aside, so now you have domain dimension scores, and once you have these scores, you get a simple average of all of them. So you total them and divide them by 7 to get an aggregate WANI. So this is what we call the Nutritional Empowerment Index. So you're doing a simple score within domain dimension, and then you're doing an average score across domain dimension. And so this is how we compute the WANI. And so collectively, we have 0.43. We are sort of less than half empowered. So on 43% of the indicators, we actually come out as empowered, and we have a long way to go before we are fully empowered. So a person who gets a 0 score is completely disempowered, and somebody who gets 1 is fully empowered, and nutritionally, because we are talking about nutritional empowerment. So this is our metric. So does anyone have questions on just this one? Because this is what we wanted to make sure that you all leave with, knowing what to do with the scores.
I think I just want to add, there's a couple of things that one could do. One could add weights, as Sudha indicated, if you had a sense that one thing was more important than another, right? So for example, if you really know that having adequate health resources is what really enables women to be nutritionally empowered, maybe you would want to count that as double, right? And we could allow for that, but we don't have enough information yet to be able to assign weights to the different domain dimensions. And then do you want to talk a little bit about why we take the average of the average?
Okay, so I first started saying that you could just compute the raw score total and divide it by 38 indicators. That essentially means that each indicator gets an equal weight. When you actually do it as a two-step process and compute a domain dimension score and then aggregate it, in effect, you're giving different weights. And that weight changes depending on, here you're adjusting for the fact that the number of indicators is different across different domain dimensions. Yeah, these two processes are the same if all of them had an equal number of indicators, but doing a two-step process essentially ensures that the number of indicators is not driving your index fully.
Yeah, exactly. So we're essentially giving equal weighting to the domain dimensions, but not equal weighting to the indicators. Does that make sense? But you could, if you wanted to, give equal weight to the indicators, but we chose not to because we don't want the number of questions to drive a weight. So for example, dietary diversity is an incredibly long question. And so if you included all those various pieces of dietary diversity as what would be food, resource. No.
Yeah.
Yes. As food resources, then you could potentially end up really pushing someone's outcomes driven entirely on that value. But so there's room to play. And I think that the Alkiri-Foster multidimensional poverty index goes into a lot of detail into the various choices people have when creating an index. And I think the thing that we really like about this specific approach is, as Sudha mentioned, you can use this almost as a scorecard. And so you can look at how different domain people are performing in different domain dimensions. And we'll show a graphic that kind of represents that nicely in a minute.
Yeah. Link this to other indices that are currently in use, especially the Women's Empowerment and Agriculture Index. We are not doing anything that's different procedurally from there. They too actually give a normative index. I mean, it's not driven by data, and they do exactly what they've done. But some of you may have attended the WEA workshop. They just procedurally, they do it differently. And we think of it as this being a simpler way, get a domain dimension score and then aggregate it over domain dimension. So it's not at all different from what WEA does. It's similar. And we do it for the same reasons that they do it. So there's no innovation there. But if you feel you want to do it differently, you need to test it in your context. And I want to just point out that we implemented the large survey with around 975 women, and I should go there in a minute. But we wanted to make sure we do care about nutritional empowerment as an intrinsic, as having intrinsic value. We care that everyone is nutritionally empowered. But we also wanted to make sure that it also has instrumental value, that the more nutritionally empowered you are, the better your nutritional status. So when we computed this index, we actually did validation exercises, and we regressed, or we modeled the relationship between BMI and anemia on the score, on the nutritional index score. And we found that depending on where the threshold was established, it had a significant relationship. That is to say that what we seek to capture through the WANI actually is a good predictor of an individual's nutritional status. And that's something you might want to do if ever you think of applying this in your own context. Now a question about, there's a question on, okay, here we have the Nutritional Empowerment Index, which is a score lying between 0 and 1. Now, in poverty, we often say that, 20% of the people are poor. So maybe to compare communities, you want the prevalence of, or the incidence of, I think different disciplines use different words. So you want to get a rate. What proportion of the people in this community are nutritionally disempowered? And how does one do that? On a scale of 0 to 1, where do we put that cutoff to classify someone as empowered or disempowered? You can do it in a data-driven way, where you say that I'm going to establish that threshold beyond which it becomes a good predictor of nutritional status. Or I can have it aspirationally. And that goes to what is a good index? Should we worry that we are at 0.43 and not at 0.75? Should we worry about it? I think that again depends on the context. And we want to take a pragmatic approach. If you want to talk to a policymaker and you say you want to keep everyone from 0, you want to take them to 1, that's not going to happen. So we think of it as aspirational thresholds, where in a community which has 0.2, you may want to tell the policymaker, let's set our target at 0.5 and see what needs to be done to get it to 0.5. Whereas in a community which has 0.5, you might want to set a target at 0.7. So where you draw the threshold and count someone as nutritionally empowered or disempowered is also a very subjective issue. And with that, I'm just going to present some results from our empirical work. So this work was supported by the Imana grant, and we are grateful to them for providing us the resources to do it. We conducted, apart from the qualitative survey, we did the survey of women, and these were mothers of children under the age of 7 years. We also wanted to choose their male spouses and their mothers-in-law if they were there in the house, just to get a sense of whether, to make comparative assessments of whether our indicators actually conform to our own understanding of the differential degrees of empowerment. And we did a survey of 975 persons, and I have to also acknowledge that the survey that we did actually piggybacked off a project called Spandan, which was funded by the BMGF, and we revisited those households to compute this index. Okay, so I'll now show you the findings. So we've plotted here the raw index. So the nutritional empowerment index, that's a 0.43. We've computed it for 975 people and drawn the distribution for the women, spouses, and mothers-in-law. So you see that the spouses are clearly different and on average have a higher score than relative to many women. And the mothers-in-law, we were expecting them to do far better, but they are doing only marginally better than the women, and for reasons that you'll get a sense of very soon. So the mothers-in-law also were not as empowered as we expected them to be. And this is a sort of a box plot that shows you contrast across both state and identity. So you see that spouses are clearly doing better. And Bihar and Orissa also, we were expecting significant differences because it's commonly said that women in Orissa are actually more empowered. That doesn't show up in our nutritional empowerment index. And here is the one that Erin was referring to. So what we've done is the total nutritional empowerment score that we get, the index, we have now decomposed it to see where it's coming from, what drives these indices. And you can see for the spouses, the institutions, for everyone, the institutions is quite a significant component. But you see these differences. So the green ones are the food agency, resource, and knowledge. The brown ones are the health resource agency and knowledge. We've tried to keep the color scheme the same throughout, and the institutions contribute that much. Now we said that, okay, we care about the total aggregate nutrition index, but we also care about the domain dimensions. And if you want to actually get policymakers to think about where to start intervening, the scorecard approach, actually looking at the raw scores and decomposing it, actually makes a lot of sense. And so we've tried to plot these raw scores, but converted. So it's actually the DD score. We've plotted those based on state and identity, on whether they're mothers-in-law, spouses, or any women. And this is quite cluttered. So I'm going to just show you a couple of slides that tell you, and not all of them are interesting, but this one, for example, is, so general levels of food knowledge are very poor. The men do somewhat better, but you see that the younger women are doing much better than their mothers-in-law. So, and that's very much a generational thing. The older women don't know as much, and that sort of shows up. And in fact, it's in the knowledge domain that dimensions that mothers-in-law do very poorly, and that counterbalances all the advantages in empowerment they have in other domain dimensions. And there's another stark example, which is the health resources. Sorry, yeah, this one, health agency. So you had a health agency module on whether you can go to the clinic alone, and do you have that freedom, who makes the decisions, and you see what a stark difference it is. Mothers-in-law actually have more power and agency in terms of taking health decisions, but the spouses actually are almost fully empowered. And I think this is the way in which we can actually use the the index to decompose it and see where are the deficits coming from for which groups. And so you can have a starting point for understanding where policy interventions are best or have the most likely opportunities for success. So I will stop here by just thanking you. We'll have time for questions and answers, but essentially this is just to direct you to the conceptual paper that actually the Committee on the Status of Women of the UN Women, they had invited us to write about nutritional empowerment. That paper is available on the UN Women website. And then there's the index paper, which is just out as a working paper, and the link is here. And I think we have ways of sharing it with all the participants, so you can take a look at the index more carefully. So now we are open to take some questions. I think we have 10 minutes, no, 20, yeah. So we have enough time, so.
So thanks. I still have a question on the tool. I understand that this is not the full version, right? And I was just wondering if you have like themes that run across the different domains, what do you call them? So for example, under health agency, you have who usually makes decisions for your own healthcare. And one thing is about decision making, and the other one is about whether you actually do have facilities. So this is running, because at the moment it's not under health resources, but it would usually be. Okay, yeah, okay.
That's exactly right. And I think that this is one of the challenges of trying to do this in 2 hours. Our survey is extensive, and what we end up finding, especially from our qualitative work, is not only are women eating last and least, but they're also using lower quality healthcare later. Right. And so we consistently find women delaying going to seek healthcare, whereas their husbands maybe go pretty quickly. And they might choose to go to like a local, I don't know what the keeps getting translated in our surveys as quacks, but I'm not quite sure what sort of a local doctor who may or may not be licensed, whereas as their partners will actually go to a health facility itself. And so we try to capture all of that. And I think that this is one of the pieces that is so important when we think about why a fit for purpose survey matters so much. Because if you think about the demographic and health survey data, they often have community level surveys that ask about, hey, is there a health clinic here? Or how far away is it? Right? And what we're finding is that there might be a health clinic somewhere, but there's differential access within a household, and there's differential usage within that household. And exactly. And so we've been really trying hard to tease out what are the things that maybe are different within households, and how do we make sure that the surveys capture those in a way that maybe other surveys haven't so far, or maybe do so unevenly. Other questions?
I was just wondering, to what extent do you worry about having social desirability bias in the way that people are answering? So I was thinking about this in the, do you have food restrictions and could you give them up if you wanted to? And wondering if people would respond, oh, of course I could give them up, I just don't want to, because they think that's what you want to hear.
So my knowledge is derives partly from Mohit and Shree's experience in the field. But in our experience, it was very critical that we interviewed the Veni women independently. And that was quite a big challenge to get them away from their mothers-in-law. And when you did that, invariably they did share. In fact, we have very few cases where they said they could give up restrictions freely. So we didn't face a problem like that. But the challenge was to get them be by themselves when you did the interview.
Yeah, I had a question about whether you have any plans to try doing this in any other parts of the world, and sort of how transferable it is to other contexts.
So after this, the index paper that is mentioned here is actually the results from Bihar and Orissa. And we decided that we wanted to do two things: test it in a different context within India, where we know that women have very different empowerment profiles, and we felt they would be more empowered. And we implemented the survey with NGOs in West Bengal, West Bengal, Kerala, and Tamil Nadu. And we also wanted to do a shorter survey. So we still felt that there was scope to make a leaner index, and we wanted to see how far can you go down that road without trading off richness. And I think on both those counts, I think we've been fairly successful, because it turns out that the Veni, a reduced abridged Veni, is both predictive of nutritional status and it's along expected lines. So the Tamil Nadu women have averages of 0.8 and the ones in Bihar have 0.4, and everything is along the lines we expected.
Sort of that second question of how does it translate outside of India, our suspicion is that it would translate quite well in the rest of South Asia, although we haven't done any validation work around that. And we also think that it could work quite well in sub-Saharan Africa. Again, we haven't done the primary data collection to validate that. This is sort of, we wanted to get the index in shape before we started to look for funding to expand scope. And one of the challenges that kind of coming to this earlier question that we keep coming back to is a lot of the secondary data that are out there that might let us start doing this are really missing what we think are some of the fundamental domain dimension questions, right? And so, for example, the demographic and health survey data, not only is it missing that intra-household health access piece, it doesn't have any questions around food knowledge, for example. And so we're kind of missing the ability to like fully use the kind of the breadth the index could offer with the secondary data we've seen so far. But we keep talking with folks about our next steps. So if you have any ideas, let us know. Simone, go ahead.
Sure. So I'm sure you could talk about this for a very long time, but I was just curious how you went from hundreds of open-ended interviews to 7 domains.
So we, the 7 domains were fixed, and that came from the drivers of nutrition literature and empowerment literature. How we went from the 169 indicators to the few that we ended up using, we ended up using factor analysis to see whether, because we had multiple ways of asking the same question, we wanted to know which one picks that underlying concept the best. And we did factor analysis by food knowledge, because we didn't want to go across and pool all the indicators together and come up with 5, because that would be entirely data driven. So we did factor analysis to see which question actually represents the underlying concept of food knowledge the best. And that helped us reduce. But all along, with each reduction, we ensured that we used to compute the weighting with different steps of reduction and make sure that the rank order correlation was preserved. So if you organized all the individuals according to rank, or from most empowerment to least empowered, the rank order would have to have a positive correlation. And then we didn't want it to be entirely data driven. So we came back and said, do we have everything that we need to represent nutrition empowerment? One big issue that happened in Orissa and Bihar is that all of the wash variables just dropped out. And we figured that actually there was no variation. Very few people had access, so it wasn't explaining anything, so that just dropped off. So we put it back in. So there was a bit of a normative assessment of whether the indicators finally worked. And that's how we got to the... But now we are testing it without doing the factor analysis. We are taking the final list of indicators and we took it to 3 states, and it's predicting the outcome variables quite well.
I was also curious about that step before. So taking all of the qualitative data. So how did you sort and organize that?
I think there were, I think most of our qualitative data, there were many institutional factors that came across as very important. Intimate partner violence, and Erin has a paper on just that in the context of Bangladesh. And we felt that the intra-household issues kept coming up. And there were 2 other factors that came up quite significantly, and that's the role of the state programs. So it's not 2 factors, it's the role of state programs in each of these domain dimensions. In Orissa, where the government has invested a lot in primary healthcare, you heard conversations in our qualitative referring to whether or not it works and them depending on that. Whereas in Bihar, it was absolutely quiet because it wasn't there. So I think the state support, intra-household issues, intimate partner violence, we knew that these were issues that repeatedly came up, and we couldn't find comparative literature that actually integrated that in a quantitative analysis, let alone an index.
So the nuts and bolts was we all sat in a room in Mussoorie with a whole pile of, printed surveys from other surveys that people had run. We fielded questions from other folks and asked for everybody to send us surveys they had used. And then we went through and tried to sift out, okay, what's missing that our qualitative data are telling us might be important. And so something that came up again and again was this issue of intimate partner violence. And it turns out it doesn't matter so much in terms of the scores for women's empowerment in nutrition, but we kept hearing that it was a really important driver for women's decision making. So we wanted to include it to just find out, well, is it actually like important from the index perspective? But it was a very long process to try to sort out which of those to include, as you can imagine.
Thank you very much. I am Adirunke from Nigeria. So I just want to take us a little bit back. I want more enlightenment. when we had this hypothetical example, we got the nutritional empowerment index as 4.3, 0.43. I just wanted to know if they are actually empowered or not, or where do we stand at that point?
I'm going to give a sort of a cheeky answer to this one. I somehow thought people in this room were going to not pretend to be somebody else and answer honestly, in which case I would have expected it to be more in the range of 0.7 to 0.9. So it's a bit of a surprise. So, but this goes to show that where you draw the threshold is entirely subjective. In Tamil Nadu, for example, rural women actually have average empowerment indicators of 0.8. And in Bihar, actually, many of them have around 0.3. And we are somewhere between the best, possibly the best Indian state and probably the worst Indian state. But there is no, it's not a relative measure, it's an absolute measure. But how do you say whether something is good or bad is relative to something, whether it's aspirational, whether it is from the past. So maybe yesterday we were 0.3 and today we are 0.43. That matters. So what comparison you make is entirely relative and depends on what your goal is and who you're doing this for.
Any other questions, comments? This is all very much work in, well, I don't know how much in progress we are at the moment, but we're always happy to get lots of feedback because I think as we're thinking about future iterations, I think there's lots of opportunities to simplify, to identify ways that we can kind of further validate this in other locations. Yeah, Kate.
I'm just really curious if you have had any thoughts of doing the Weni and the Wea in the same population.
Yes, we had planned to actually, and we were really excited about it. But then this thing called Brexit happened, and our budget fell apart. and so, I mean, Brexit didn't. Yes, no, exactly. The fear of Brexit happened, and so we decided. We ended up having to cut our survey cost. Like we just couldn't afford to have a survey that included both modules with a large enough sample to let us do the comparison. But you're absolutely right, and I think we know in no way at all are like trying to go head to head with WEA. Rather, I think that they're both really valuable and they both might be telling us different things and we just don't know yet, right? And I think similarly with like the WELI and some of these other great, like Sarah Young's work around water and women's water use and those sorts of things. I think there's a real opportunity out there to run a survey with multiple measures to allow us to really compare and understand, okay, what outcomes do these predict well? And is it the case that maybe WEA does super awesome on dietary diversity, which by the way, we don't do super awesome with, but maybe we're getting more at anemia, right? And sort of getting a sense of like, okay, if there's a specific outcome you're really trying to track or to nudge, might there be one that would be better than the other? And we've talked a little bit about trying to figure out how to do that. We haven't had anyone bite yet.
I'd like to add, apart from budgetary issues, with the qualitative work, we realized that we didn't quite understand fully what would measure nutritional empowerment well. So all the multiple questions we asked were asking the same thing in different ways, and all of them went into our first survey. So the first survey actually took something like 2.5 hours to field. The second time, the abridged version now takes half an hour to 45 minutes. So I think we needed that big, long survey for us to get a sense of what is worth measuring and what is reliable as a measure. So I think we learned a lot in that process. And now we have a preferred way of asking each of those questions because we know it works. You had a follow-up question?
To what extent have you compared your questions themselves to the WEA and Sarah Young's, I think it's the WHYs? And because it seems like some of these, there's a set of core questions that you're all asking. And so there could be some opportunity to have like a core module that you could ask and then just build the additional pieces for which of the indicators you actually wanted to get out of it.
Yeah, actually, this is an interesting point because as we were developing the WENI, that's when the WEA also became a little more nutrition-centric. So we had an opportunity, in fact, in the ANH forum to to actually learn where they were with their nutrition modules within VIA. And we did find a lot of similarities. There are a few instances where it's different. But one big issue we feel is where we are very different from VIA is we started with the premise that you're measuring something in agriculture, which is very distant from nutrition. And we wanted to bring our measure of empowerment close to nutrition, which meant that we would have to include people who are not in agriculture at all. And in fact, in Orissa, most of the resources, many of them are landless. Landlessness is 66% in Bihar. So how would you think of empowerment in agriculture when you care about their nutrition? And so we had to depart a lot, and we factored in common property resources and work figures in a very large way in the context of nutrition. So I think there are significant differences, and we are hoping to have conversations with VIA to see if they are really interested in nutrition outcomes and their population is no longer fully focused on agriculture. And in fact, most agriculture households are pluri-activity households now. Can you bring the flavor of work in general into their modules or their index?
And I think this is,
You want to add
true.
something? Okay,
No,
yeah.
I think it's a really, I think many of the indices are meeting particular population needs, and and I think that that's just an ongoing challenge. And so one of the things that we've been thinking about and toying with is ours was very much designed with a rural population in mind. And I think there's a question, we've had some folks come back to us and say, well, could it be used for urban populations? And I think it could be, but I wouldn't want to do it without doing a whole bunch of piloting first, right? And potentially changing the flavor of some of these questions so that we're not so focused on questions of animal husbandry, but making sure we're getting other things as well. And
likewise, overnutrition, or I don't like to call it that, but obesity and overweight. Many people say that the more empowered might well be people who are also who are not undernourished, but might be. And VANI is not designed to go there yet. So if that's all, I just want to end by saying that I see Bharti is also here. She was our co-PI. And I want to say that this gave us an opportunity to bring a lot of graduate students, nutritionists, sociology, economics, and we had a really good time talking interdisciplinarity on a daily basis and pulling it together. There were tough times. And I want to thank CORD, which is the Collaborative Research and Dissemination, which is based in Delhi, and they took most of the responsibility for the fieldwork, and Mohit represents that. Anuradha Dey is the one who was supporting, and she's a co-author on our paper. So I just want to acknowledge all the number of partners who are a part of this journey. So the journey is not ended, but yeah, thank you very much for attending this. We are happy to keep in touch beyond the lab. Thank you.